Here we are talking about MRO essentials. We're back, and we have an outstanding guest
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
speaker
whoa,
with
whoa.
us
Just
today.
easy on the intro. Easy on the intro.
I know, but he told me he wouldn't do it if I didn't speak him up.
That's a good
That's
point.
That's
just
right.
the way it works.
Yeah.
So,
I know.
My ego comes first. You guys know that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
well,
I c-
and I probably don't need to introduce you, but I will, right? This
okay.
is Norm Poynter. For any of you guys that don't know him, old Norm, that's what I call him, Big Norm. Um, Norm's a Canadian, and he's well traveled, so don't hold the Canadian part against him. But he gets around, and Norm's been in the enterprise asset management space for, gosh, Norm, I don't know. You were giving
Sorry.
keynotes when I graduated college, so that tells everybody how old you are. Well, that is another way of saying that is Norm forgot more about enterprise asset management than I ever knew. So there you go. Norm,
He
it's
forgot
an
it, but
absolute pleasure to have you here
but
today,
wait, hold
man.
on. He forgot it, but I'm trying to teach him the MRO side. So this is a good mix. He's got a lot to go on materials, but he's pretty good on the maintenance side.
Yeah.
Pretty damn good. So, Norm, if you'd like to introduce yourself, man, or you could just go along with what I said because it's probably
I
pretty good.
I think we'll just go along with what you said, Justin. We'll
Awesome,
never get
man.
anywhere. Never get
We
anywhere.
Yeah.
won't.
Can't even get
No.
off the intro for God's
We're
sake.
2 minutes in and we can't shut up. Anyways, so hey Norm, I brought you on and again, thanks for joining us. But I brought you on because I wanted to tell kind of our story, right? Like I wanted to tell people how we met and the work we've done together, and specifically, I want to talk about IPSECA and what it did when I was leading an organization for an oil and gas company, planning and scheduling and supply chain and procurement. So just to give you guys a little history of that, I met Norm at a conference. I was really, really struggling with planning and scheduling. Um, my guys, it just felt like we were jumping from fire to fire. I just really didn't have a lot of focus or understanding, just big picture. We didn't have a playbook, I guess is probably the best way to put
Yeah.
it. And I talked with Norm, and Norm came over, and gosh, Norm, you only spent like what, 6 months with us tops, maybe. I don't even
Yeah.
know if it was that long. And anyways, what Norm taught us was, I mean, I'll be forever in your debt for what you taught us. And you taught us at Sitka, and I didn't. When you said it, I couldn't. I thought you were stuttering. I didn't know what you were saying. I learned it, and man, when I learned it, it changed my world. And so, for you guys that don't know what Sitka is, and I'll have Norm, I'll have you walk through those steps if you don't mind. But it's
Sure.
identify, plan, schedule, execute, close, and analyze. And we'll walk through that. And Norm, what I really want to talk about is how once we got that right, especially the P in planning, our supply chain really bloomed and took off. So
Hmm.
if you don't mind, man, give us a rundown of what that
Sure.
is and what that means
Sure.
to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me on the podcast. We've talked about it for a while, and I'm happy to be here. And we've on our side, on the EAM side, we've talked about doing podcasts too. But it's nice to intermix the two, the MRO supply chain piece along with enterprise
Mm.
asset management. Just makes it a little more exciting because this topic is not all that riveting sometimes. But I think this is a good platform for that. So,
Mm.
um, IPSECA is been around for, I don't even know where it really came from. I think maybe it came out of SAP implementations way back in the 90s. Maybe it's been around before that. I've never actually gone and Googled it to try to figure it out. But what I think it adds for most people is it adds a framework, or it adds a high level value chain process of some kind that's simple enough to understand, and hopefully you can
Yeah.
remember it, right? And the most organizations we go into, they're doing IPSECA. They just maybe don't know it. I think you were the case, Justin, when we met with you. And everybody does it, whether it's IT, whether it's you at home, whether it's professionally in a maintenance organization. Everybody's identifying work. Everybody's doing some type of planning. Maybe it's good or bad,
Yep.
remains to be seen. Then there's some type of scheduling occurs, right? Scheduling is fully functionally dependent upon planning because if you haven't got a plan, you can't really schedule. Execution, well, planning is to remove roadblocks for execution. Arguably, scheduling is to optimize execution. The close out of the work is the feedback, plan, do, check, act. Hopefully, most companies are doing maybe a lot of planning, a lot of doing, and not a lot of checking and acting. Sometimes we can talk about that. And then the analysis, that really gets us into the asset performance management space if you look at root cause failure analysis and so on and so
Mm.
forth. And so without that understanding, I think many folks potentially are missing what we're trying to do in enterprise asset management. And it's a FRACAS model, right? Like it's failure, recording, analysis, and corrective action system. So there's another acronym for you. But why are we doing work management? Well, we've probably identified failures or malfunctions and we need to correct them. And whether that's in
Yeah.
people, process, data, or equipment, we have to follow some mechanism, and we hope to have a work management mechanism for that. So the focusing in on some of those high level practices or process steps is really important. You identify the wrong work. Well, you're planning the wrong work. You're scheduling the wrong work. You're executing the wrong work. It's a bit of a cascading effect. So the
Mm.
something I picked up from Tim a long time ago was the demand signal concept. And we in EAM, we are creating that demand signal. Arguably,
Mhm.
sometimes we're doing it poorly. Sometimes we're not doing it at all. And then we're
Mm.
really reacting, or we're having to force supply chain to react. So that demand signal, and I love that term. Actually, I love the fact that I've stolen that from you, Tim. Similar to how Justin has stolen things from me. Um,
Absolutely.
you're stuck if we don't create that demand signal, and many companies struggle with that. And that's part of identify. That's part of plan. That's part of your asset strategies. That's part of your capital projects execution. I mean, there's a lot goes into the I and the P of IPSECA long before you ever start to schedule stuff.
Yep, spot on.
And so when I think about identify, sorry, Tim, real quick. When I think about
Mm.
identify, I break it into two things, right? I break it into maintenance plans because I call that identifying work that I know I need to do, and then which is on the PM side or the preventive maintenance side. And then I think about it on the corrective maintenance side, and I think about bombs and sometimes some task lists, right, for some really highly repetitive things that we do on that side. And man,
Yep.
what a difference it makes when I can forecast my spend because you've identified the right work. To your point, right? Like I've got task lists in tied to my maintenance plans that are just and I run a couple standard SAP transactions, and from a procurement standpoint I can probably 60-70% of my spend I can forecast that and go talk to my vendors and say, hey, like
Yeah.
these are the things I'm going to need and
Yeah.
when I'm going to need them, right?
Yeah. So,
I think about a time. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I was just gonna say, because this is IPSEC is new. I mean, I've heard about it from you guys, but I've never lived and breathed it from your end of it. But it's, I was thinking when we just had that big cyclone came through Brisbane, and I had a bunch of trees down, and then I had to chop all these things up, and I think, okay, I've got to plan this work. But one thing I didn't do, I didn't go check my materials, which is what happens a lot. Is I needed to use my chainsaw. I hadn't used it for a few months. Were my blade sharpened? Did I have fuel? Did I have any barred chain oil? All these things. So I'm out there ready to go, and then realized, oh shit, I don't have any fuel for my chainsaw. I got a new blade, but I've got to put it on my chainsaw, and then that just stopped the job. And you can imagine a maintenance that happens all the time. Where I had to, oh shit, I was ready
Yeah.
to go at 8 o'clock in the morning. Then I realized I had to stop. I had to run down and start, get this, do this, and the job didn't start for another 2 hours. That's reality. That happens all the time in our world, in the industry side of things, where people come, yep, I'm ready to do the job, and then there's the materials haven't arrived, they weren't planned, they weren't checked, they weren't balanced with maintenance, and this is
Yeah.
exactly what happens in like the industrial world all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always the parts. So I do a lot of mechanical work on the side, right, as a hobby,
Mm.
and was a mechanic at one point in time in my life. And it's always the parts. I'm always there to pull the wrench or run the chainsaw. But if
Yeah.
the chainsaw hasn't got fuel or I don't have that bolt that I need, can't finish the job. So it's always the parts. And I think we, for whatever reason, I mean, organizations recognize that, but they don't really. And the structured work, when you talk about the maintenance plans or you talk about the corrective work, so preventive and corrective. The preventive work we would consider to be structured, right? So that structured work that's going to happen over and over again for the life of the asset. That should have been
Yeah.
developed during the construction phase, during commissioning. The work needs to be run much earlier than it ever is,
Hey,
and that's never, not very often is it happening. The corrective work, arguably, we know if we've done asset management strategies, if we've done an FMEA or we've done even just some thinking, we kind of know what the corrective activities are going to be, and we should be creating the corrective task lists as well.
Yep.
That isn't done. When we go do assessments of organizations, I'm sure you guys see it too. There's not a lot of structure to the corrective work. It's very reactive. It's
Yeah.
very one-off, a lot of waste, and that upfront activity, the thinking that needs to go into the operation from a maintenance perspective and a reliability perspective hasn't really been done. They're
Yep.
operating, and obviously they've got all their safeguards in place to operate, but it's the maintenance side that didn't have the same attention to detail.
Yeah.
Ish.
Twice, cut
yeah,
once.
and what I think, amen, brother. And what I really fell in love with too, Norm, and it was probably the first time I'd ever worked with somebody that had this philosophy and this mindset, right? I mean, think about it, right? And we've talked a little bit about this, and I'm not going to throw names or anything out there, but we had a company come in and help us implement PM and MM. And gosh, they were here. They were with us for 3 or 4 years. It took a long time to get that in, and we didn't really have that IPSECA mindset. And what I really liked that probably changed our world the fastest was once we set some standards or procedures, or we could get into your intellectual capital hierarchy. Um,
Hmm.
Once we set those, what I loved was we went in the background and configured SAP to require the things we needed
Yeah.
to be
Yep.
successful in that step. So, like, give us an example of that around like corrective
Sure.
maintenance notifications. Like, talk about
Yeah,
that,
sure.
and then what that looks like, and let's connect that to our supply chain.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay. So I'll just back up just one step. So I consider SAP to be an open loop system for the most part. If you go on Amazon.com to order something or .au, let's not be prejudiced against the Australians here. You cannot get your product shipped unless you pay for it. It's not going to ship it for you, right?
Yep.
There's a hard stop, there's a control point. But SAP really, you can create an equipment record with very few system mandatory required fields, of course. Same with notifications, same with work orders. So that is really saying that IPSECA is open-ended. Well, identify is optional, planning is optional, scheduling it, all those steps are optional. So what we do, as you referred to, Justin, is we use the intellectual capital hierarchy, which starts out with some type of a vision or a guiding statement that's going to set direction. We want to set a policy. Maybe the policy says nothing more than all work shall go through SAP work management or go through a work order, use whatever language you want, but we're going to create some directional indicator behaviorally in the culture of the organization, similar to safety, right? You must have a confined, or you shall have a confined space permit to do
Yeah. Yep.
confined space work, something like that. Then when we get to the process steps, we take a fairly high level look at that and go, well, what do you want from identify work? What's the input and
Okay.
what's the output, right? So
Yep.
from a malfunction perspective, if we look at ISO 14224 table 6, it defines clearly what you need to collect for malfunction data related to equipment history and the corrective actions that you perform. And so we take that and write it into a standard, and our standards by definition state, you define your minimum requirement and quality expectation, which must be met, and it's twofold. So systematically, I can turn on fields in SAP to be mandatory. So description, equipment, functional location, maintenance activity type. If you've turned that functionality on, I can force a failure mode through the coding code field, things like that through configuration. It's very nasty to do it through config because it's going to force you around the screen in an order that you may not like. So we typically do a user exit. So based on that activity of sitting down and saying, what are you
Mm.
wildly interested in from an
Yep.
identify work perspective, especially for malfunctions, not for general, but for malfunctions, we want to know, let's say it's the equipment and it's got to have a unique serial number. So we want that equipment record to go on not just a functional location, but an actual equipment with a unique serial number. And we force that to be captured, and we force, let's say, effect
Mm.
on system, and we force a failure mode. So that right away, hopefully, got us to the right piece of equipment, hopefully. And then subsequently, if there's a bill of material or there's a corrective task list or
Bingo.
there's
Yep.
related data to that, then we've set the stage to set up the work order to create a clear demand signal to supply chain through that closed loop. Like we don't allow the notification to be saved without those minimum requirements being met. Now, quality is a little different. It could be the wrong notification, but we typically then look at a screening and routing step within the process,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
would
Yeah.
be below identify work. That'd be a level 2 to say, well, somebody's got to review that notification and indicate, is this the correct piece of equipment? And so by preparing that data and controlling it up front, we're supporting planning, we're supporting scheduling, we're supporting supply chain, we're
Yep.
supporting execution, right? So you got to start way on the left-hand side of the process and get it right there. Otherwise, it's just an increasingly large ball of poop as it goes to the right.
And I cannot, I'm serious when I say this. Like, wasn't it nice to be able to look at our inventory after we put these minimum requirements in and say, oh, we're holding all of this inventory for maintenance plans. Oh, we're holding all of that inventory for critical spares. Oh, that's just for routine, you know, uh,
Correct.
low
Yeah.
level or common failures. But it helps us keep our guys on their wrenches and our production up, right? And I,
Yeah.
Norm, we struggled and we struggled and we struggled to find that right balance. And it really wasn't until we got these basic blocking and tackling plans on the really from the IPSECA side, right? Like just
Yeah.
Yeah.
understanding and from that intellectual capital hierarchy, understanding what we needed and why we wanted it, that it was like, oh, well, why didn't you guys just say it, right? We had operations fighting one way, supply chain fighting the other way. And they were like, oh, well, shit, why didn't you just say something? Well, yeah. And then we put that into the standard. And man, I heard a guy say, once people get a taste of it, man, you better get ready and you better be staffed right because they are
Yeah.
not going to be patient when they don't have
No.
that type
Well,
of support
let's.
from the supply
I want
chain
to
side.
jump in there
Tim, were you going
too.
to say something, man? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to jump in there because that's how. And I'm more curious, Norm, on this is. So somebody creates a notification, and when I was working in New Zealand, they had enabled anybody. Matter of fact, the cleaners who saw every part of the plant put in the most
Mm-hmm.
notification because they were invested. Now they weren't putting in, hey, this bearing and housings have failed. It was more little things, but it was a great motivator. So my question is once those notifications are started, whether they're good or bad, who typically does that first vetting process? Is it the planner or is it before it gets to a planner? And then when would you in this process, and I know we're talking about a lot of SAP, at what point are you attaching materials? Is this during the planning stage when you can ideally see a bomb? Like Justin, I'm a huge fan of bombs. I try to push bombs in because then they make making tasks lists much easier anyways. But where does that step begin? And
Mhm.
this is before the demand signal's triggered, but it's just this first bit.
So there's quite a bit to unpack there. So the premise has always been for my entire career that anybody should be able to create a notification.
Okay,
That is,
good.
of
Yeah.
course, wrought with potential erroneous data because
Yeah,
somebody
yeah.
who doesn't understand the process, right,
Yeah.
picks when we try to keep the configuration in SAP simple. So we try to have a general notification, a malfunction notification, and an activity report. And arguably,
Oh,
if you
okay.
look back at client 00 in SAP, the vanilla client that everybody gets, that client has nothing but that configuration in it. It's been like that for a long, long time.
Yep.
There's a refurbishment order and there's some other stuff in there, but for the most part, SAP designed the system way back when in that fashion. So
Okay.
first off, if the wrong notification type is picked, so say somebody picks a general notification type for a malfunction activity, well,
Yeah.
QM for years and years and years offered functionality to change notification types. A few companies I know of used to have a web interface way back when web was brand new. And then you would enter your notification through the web and you'd enter a QM notification, which allowed you to make the change and you could change it from a QM to a PM notification back in the day. and that would get it started down the right path. Well,
Yeah.
PM has now got that functionality. So if you create a general
Okay.
and it should be a
Yep.
malfunction, there's a step before you create the work order, you can adjust the notification type. Now that
Okay.
is dependent upon the organization, right? So who's reviewing notifications in the morning meeting? Is it a operations maintenance coordinator? Is it a planner? Shouldn't be a planner. Planner is there to plan future work, right? So that vetting activity should have occurred long before the planner receives the notification. He should just be there to plan the scope of work, and he should have all the information and data to support that. So I
Yeah.
would hope it's a supervisor, operations maintenance coordinator, an operator, a maintenance tech. Somebody is reviewing that at a level of capability that allows
Okay.
them to say, well, this notification needs more information. It's a wrong notification type. It's the wrong piece of equipment. Or maybe, hey, we've got to send this back and go, we've got to do a field estimate of some kind on the
Yeah.
notification
Yeah. Yeah.
before we get to a work order. But then I hope that they don't keep a notification backlog and a work order backlog. I hope that they move that notification that they've said, hey, we're going to do some work here. Let's get it to the notification or to the work order. So let's create
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
work order. Notification is going to be the history document. So we're going to move on to the work order document, do our planning
Yeah.
and our estimating and our scoping and our whatever. And so now at that point, we would look to start the association of materials, whether that be through a bill of material or from a service or service provider or a task list or however we're targeting getting that data on that work order.
Yeah.
And at this point, it's like rough cut, right? Like we're maybe not even sure when we're going to do the work or if we're going to do the work still.
Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
could just be in the early stages of understanding the work. And that would get done on the work order, and then you have functionality to check material availability and
Yeah.
readjust dates and add materials and et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera. So
So this is interesting. I like the concept of bringing in operations. So now you're linking kind of the three big parts: operations, maintenance, and eventually your supply chain. Who creates the work order? Is it when you
yeah,
do that vetting? Let's say it's an operations supervisor. He or she says, "Yeah, yep, that's true. That is a malfunction. We need to get that fixed. I can run for a while, but I got to fix it." Okay, great. Then is that then
yep.
who does the actual conversion from a notification into the work order where then the planner takes over?
Well, in SAP's strength and in SAP's weakness, you can take a couple steps there, right? You can put the
Hmm.
notification in process, which arguably changes the system status and moves it to a queue that maybe the planner picks up, and then
Ah,
the planner creates the work order.
okay, gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or you can hit the create order button, and that associates the notification to a work order and puts it in process and puts a work order in the created state. So
Gotcha. Okay, it's
take
statuses
your
then. Okay.
pick on the organization as to who's. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And now SAP has introduced, it used to be IPSECA, and now there's 9 steps. It used to be the 6 boxes of maintenance. Now they've added a screening and routing and an approval step and one other one, which escapes me right at this particular moment. So they've
Mm,
added some more depth to that to a
yep.
degree. But without that functionality, we simply build in process control points to ensure that if it's going to move from a notification to a work order, that there's
Yeah.
an approval step on the work order before the money's spent or something, right? But ideally, you've got a review daily of new notifications that have come in with operations, with maintenance, with engineering. Supply chain is never there at that meeting, but
Yeah.
somewhere in the week, as you're building schedules and you're building plans, supply chain should be included in those conversations, right?
Absolutely. 100%. No, that
Yeah.
this is good. So this is even in my head, this is giving me more structure how the steps progress through because I'm 100% aligned with there's got to be very clear steps on when A goes to B and then who's part of the B process going to C and when inventory planning or you've got people involved in the supply chain with maintenance and scheduling in terms of can you do this job or not, which is another quick topic I want to
Yeah.
bring up. Sorry, Justin, because I'm more curious. I've got Norm's attention here.
Sure.
Is we
This is
talk
great,
like you
man.
mentioned demand signal, Norm, and this is one that I think a lot of businesses I talk to do not realize. As soon as you release that work order, that money's spent or it's about to be spent, and they're releasing,
Yep.
not realizing that hey, if you got materials where those reservations are created, MRP's running, and those goods are being purchased, just to decide I'm going to reschedule or cancel it altogether, and I think people look at, well, supply chain, you guys control spend, get down your inventory. And I'm like, guys, I'm here just trying to make sure maintenance can do what they want. They're buying it. And like, what do you mean they're buying it? I said, well,
Yeah.
as soon as they release that reservation, it goes right through either consumes inventory or it's going to procurement and it's bought. So I think that understanding and what your
Yeah.
experience there in terms of getting maintenance to understand, as soon as you release something, you've effectively approved that spend on people and parts.
Yeah. Everything we've said up to this point in time, there's probably a million opinions that we could gather from either our listeners or from people we work with. So, first off, I guess the story that I've told or the picture that I've depicted is relatively simple. It's not fraught with, little nuances, et cetera. It's kind of the standard.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is what we would deploy when you go into an organization and you're looking to just stabilize them or you're looking to bring them to a particular level of good practice, right?
yeah,
When it comes to releasing a work order, we're in a similar state, okay? SAP provides you at the each component level and or the operation level, the individual purchase requisition reservation indicator opportunities. So even though you release the work order, you can turn everything off so that it does not
yeah,
release upon release or does not create a demand upon release. That's a lot of work though, right?
yeah,
So if you
yeah,
miss
exactly.
one, you release that work order. So again, from an open loop perspective, unless you turn on work order budget functionality, or unless you turn on some user status functionality to control when release is okay, like
Yeah, yeah,
security, maybe Justin's the planner, I'm the technician. So I create the notification, Justin creates the plan, and Tim, you're the maintenance manager. You're the only one that can release a work order. Now you're
okay,
fully functionally dependent upon Justin's planning ability
Yep.
to come up with an estimate that you agree upon. And maybe if you two are in cahoots because you know you can't get money out of the budget, you're building work orders with slush funds them anyway for other work, right? So there's all these challenges with that release step and how do you
yeah,
control it? How do you come up with a budget, right? If Justin's using a material price that's outdated or maybe the material doesn't have a
yeah.
price on it or he
That's
put
a
a
whole
service
nother
in at
video.
$1, right? Exactly. So release release is an important step, probably
Huge.
the most
Yes.
important step
Absolutely.
in IPSECA. And it has to be thought through and it has to be
Yeah,
regimented and it has to have rigor and it has to have, the tenaciousness of somebody to say no,
yeah,
because you
yeah,
need to
yeah.
say
Good
no
point.
once in a while, right? You
Yeah,
need to ensure. So typically, though, when the planner is planning, the planner's not really a planner, they're an expediter. So
yeah.
they're throwing a bunch of stuff on the work order and they're hitting release because the technician is standing behind them saying, I got to go run to the warehouse to get the materials. Can you release
Yep.
that work order?
Yeah.
And so the whole thing is arguably broken, right? Because that work order shouldn't really get released until you're starting to build a schedule or until you know you're going to execute the work for sure. And then, even if you're going to go in and leave the order in a created state and you release one operation or for a service and you release another component item for
Long
a
lead
long
time.
lead item, well, then, right, the work order has to get released before any goods receipt or service entry could be done against those. But in theory, you're doing that to enable the purchasing, enabling supply chain to meet that
Spot
demand
on.
signal in a timely, efficient manner. But maintenance isn't necessarily like that because they're behind the eight
No.
ball, they're reactive. So they're releasing that work order. The warehouse gets the demand on a reservation or
Yeah, yeah,
on a purchase rec or both. They go out, they do their work, they get it to the warehouse, they kit it, it sits there, and then there's
yeah.
crickets, right?
Well, it's
So
funny you
it's
mention this.
that's a
So,
that's a
look,
pivotal point.
when I was in the Philippines, I was working for a large company. I was in the Philippines and I was in the warehouse because obviously I was always on the supply chain side, helping them work it out. And I realized this is where I realized maintenance didn't know what a purchase order is, but they sure as hell knew what a work order was. And anybody in this business at the time could release work orders. So if they wanted something put into the warehouse,
Right.
they created a work order, released it, waited overnight because I knew the POs would
Yeah.
get released. The PO get created, they come in the next day, they'd cancel the work order. And it got to the point that they had buried their forklift in the warehouse because they couldn't get to it because there's so many materials flooding in.
Mm,
because that whole demand signal release approval step was broken, non-existent. And this helps. This is really
Yeah.
important to
Yeah.
explain to people how, man, that step right there is to control cost is critical.
Yeah. But it's not easy. Like it's easy to
No.
say. We can sit here and talk about it, and I've talked about it for 28 years now,
Yeah.
and it's still different at every organization we go to, and it really boils down to the understanding people have of the integration between, well, let's go back to operations. Let's go to the integration between operations, reliability,
Yeah.
maintenance, and supply chain, and then probably finance, right? It's got to have a thread that is traced all the way through that, right? What's the production plan? What's
Yep.
the reliability target metric? What are we trying to achieve? What's
Yeah.
maintenance tasked with? What is supply chain able to do? What's finance allowing to occur from a budget perspective?
Yeah.
All of those parties really have to be on the same page. And that fellow or the fellow or lady or whoever it is that could even be a monkey for that matter, that hits the release icon in the work order, they have to have all of that in their head. They have
yep.
to think about
Yeah.
all of those players when they hit that release button. And that's
Mm.
difficult to do. Like, let's be
It's
clear,
Yeah.
it's
extremely difficult,
difficult.
right? And that's
Yeah. Yeah.
why, Norm, what you guys do is so valuable because you help organizations identify what's critical, identify what we should be working on, right? You help
Yeah.
people just kind of normalize it. And, IPSECA is one of those examples. Again, we talked about the intellectual capital hierarchy. That's another example. Right. Like it's amazing. It's fun to just listen to you talk and ramble on and on. And we could do this I
Oh,
really do
man.
enjoy it. It's fun listening to you and I picked up a
Yeah,
ton from you. But I'm
yeah,
telling you, once organizations finally slow down to go fast, I think that's one of the things that I heard Pascal say that to me. He's like, Justin, just slow down. Just slow down.
yeah,
Let's slow
yeah,
down to go
yeah,
fast.
yeah.
And once
So
we
one of
did
the
that, it changed my world, man. So anyways.
Yeah. And that's arguably what when we come in and talk about the intellectual capital hierarchy, policy, process, standard, procedure, and the associated management continuum of where do you want to be prescriptive? Where do you want to be ad hoc? Where do you have a sanctioned degree of variety? Where do you
Yep.
have a lot of wiggle room? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
the leaders endorsing, enforcing in that conversation is you got to slow down for it. Justin, I still remember the first day you were like, we're going to go after this session's done at 4 o'clock. We're going to write our standards. We're going to be done. There's nothing to do tomorrow, right?
Yeah, that was the stupidest thing I've ever said in my life. And you just sat in the corner and said, "Go ahead, fat boy. I can't wait to watch this.
Yeah,
Here, let me give you
exactly.
some gasoline.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
want some
Oh,
matches?"
man.
So the thinking, like all of these people that I see around the world that I speak to or that I work with or that we go into and do a day of sharing or whatever we do, they do not have time to think. And
Nope.
they need an opportunity to think. And quite often the assessment projects that we do gives them a little bit of time to think. And then if we get the engagement to go and work through their minimum requirements and quality expectations,
Yep.
we give them quite a bit of time to think, and then they have to slow down. They have to slow down. They have to
Yeah.
change
Yeah.
because they've said, hey, we now expect something different out of identify work. We expect something different out of
Yep.
operations. We expect something different out of reliability. We expect something different out of supply chain. But supply chain now expects we give them a clearer demand signal,
That's exactly
Yep.
right. That's
right?
exactly it.
Spot on. And
And
this is where
and
bringing in
the
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 supply
playing
chain at the
field
right
has been
time.
leveled.
Yep.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah.
All
And
righty.
that
Oh,
what's
man.
so cool about it is now there's an expectation, right? There's an expectation. We have to include supply chain. We need them to come to the table. We need them,
Yep.
right? Because I'm setting minimum expectations on the maintenance side that I need these guys to get their crap together and make sure they have what I need to be able to achieve those goals.
Yeah.
So
Well, and that's a good
it's
point. So
it's just
bringing in,
great. Yeah,
bringing in scheduling. How can you schedule if you haven't even checked the material availability? And that happens a lot. So that's where we show is like, guys,
that's
there's
exactly right.
there's basic functionality to do that, and that
You
leads you
cannot.
right back to data. You have to have supply chain data got to be spot on because maintenance have to know if there's three. If it says
Yeah.
there's three in the warehouse, I've got to trust that. That's really important. And anyways, that's probably another
Yeah.
podcast, and I think
Amen, brother.
we've gone on for a while here,
Yeah, we
but
need to get you back on to talk about some of this stuff
yeah, I
for
think we just do
sure.
the
It would
back half
be,
Oh,
maybe because this is interesting.
yep.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot to dig into. Even this was sort of
Yeah,
a, I don't know, 30,000 foot level
Hmm.
conversation, right? Because there's a lot of things to think about that sometimes is enabled by SAP functionality, sometimes is hindered by SAP functionality.
yeah,
Quite
yeah,
often, it's the lack of having the maintenance build completed before we go off and try to do IPSECA. We just, like you mentioned, Justin, most system integrators don't do the intellectual capital hierarchy start of the project, right? The ASAP methodology even starts at blueprinting. Well, blueprinting doesn't include a mechanism to really get yourself organized, to really think about what you're doing. It throws people into workshops that you've got to understand terms you've never heard of before.
Yep.
What's a functional location? You got to make a decision. What's your functional location edit mask? Well, who the hell
yeah, yeah,
knows,
Tell
right?
you,
yep,
tell me. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Spot on.
you've got to give time. You've got to give people time to think, and then if they don't fall too far from the apple tree when it comes to how you're using standard SAP, and most of this works, right? But if they get a little sideways or finance drives it or somebody just cross-threads a couple things, well, then it's a bit problematic. It's hard to get
Yeah,
back from there, right? Like remember the criticality conversation, Justin, like that was
Mm.
a few months long, you guys deciding how you're going to do criticality and understand what's important and what's not, right?
Yeah, that
And
took a while for sure.
yeah. So, but it's got to be done because otherwise everything's a emergency. But
yeah.
Easy, easy. Hey, I see what you did there. That is another topic for another day. In fact, I'm going to invite
Oh
you back.
man.
That's a teaser for our next podcast with Norm. Well, hey Norm, we need to probably wrap this up. We're getting a little long winded here, but
yeah,
man, thank you so much for
Yep.
joining us. And guys, like you guys out there listening to this, if you want to hear more about this, there is not a better human in the world that can talk to you about getting this stuff organized. Norm, you guys run an incredible team over there at AMA. I'm sure
Mhm.
we'll put a link on here on how to get a hold of you guys and get in touch with you guys for sure. But we can't do it without you guys. And I tell guys all the time, if from the supply chain standpoint, we are a
Yep.
service-based organization. At the end of the day, if the maintenance guys don't need us, we don't feed our kids. So, um, you know,
right.
we're here to help, and once we get on the same page and we learn and we start playing from the same playbook, man, it starts. Yeah, I've seen it firsthand. It turns into a whole bunch of fun for sure. So, again, man, thank you
Exactly.
for all you've done for me
Yep.
personally
Yeah,
and joining us on this
you bet,
podcast as
Justin.
well.
You
Yep.
bet. Thanks for all your kind words, you guys, and for
Thanks,
having
Norm.
me here. It's always great to hang out and see you guys. So take
Yep.
care.
Take care, man.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.